Hello, students. Welcome back to Mr. Lawhon's AP European History class. Today, we are going to continue in Chapter 8 with Essential Question 8.2. If you were with us in 8.1, we talked about the mercantile empires of Europe, and now we're going to kind of switch gears and dive into how did these European empires rule their colonies. And we're going to focus specifically on Spain because if you look at the time, 1600s, early 1700s, Spain probably had the most effective, the most long-lasting colonial empire at the time. So we're going to dive into Essential Question 8.2, how did the Spanish rule their New World colonies? Pause if you need to. Okay, the Spanish colonial system. Now, real quick, why are we learning about this? Well, guys, if I'm going to be honest with you, this whole presentation today would be a great context if you were going to do a DBQ or an LEQ about the American Revolution. Because what you're going to see here is how Spain is going to rule their colonies is going to be copied by the British. And it's going to cause problems between the British and their American colonies. So, if you need a why are we learning about this? Well, guys, there you go. It's a good context into understanding the American Revolution. So, let's dive into this. The Spanish colonial system. Now, you guys have seen this map because in class we did an SAQ with this map as its stimulus. So, technically, let's talk about colonial government. Technically, it starts from the top down. And by the top, I mean the top of government. Who's at the top of government in Spain? Well, the king or the queen or the crown, right? That's what we call the crown. So technically, the Spanish crown ruled the Spanish colonies. But you might be like, well, wait a second, Lawhon. Mexico is pretty far away from Spain. South America, pretty far away from Spain. How can the Spanish crown rule something so far away? Well, guys, here's the deal. The king appointed what was called the Council of the Indies. So imagine a whole bunch of Spanish nobles sitting around a council appointed by the king. Now, those guys were not responsible, they were responsible for setting all of the colonial laws. But they were also responsible for nominating viceroys. Now, a viceroy is a leader in the colony that basically speaks on behalf of the council and the king. So the viceroys were the direct rulers in New Spain or in the Spanish colonies. Now, under the viceroys, they basically ruled in the name of the king, and they made sure that the king and the council's laws were carried out. So the viceroys live in the colonies, kind of like governors of the different colonies. And there's different viceroys over different what are called viceroyalties, which are basically like districts. All right, so imagine, guys, New Spain is divided up into these districts, and every district is ruled by a viceroy. And the viceroy answers to the king and to the Council of the Indies to make sure everything gets done. Does that make sense, kind of? All right. Now, under the viceroys were smaller councils made up of more local officers who controlled small towns. So, like I said, it starts from the king. The king tells his council what to do. The council then relays this message to the viceroy, who controls one part of a little area in New Spain, or to the viceroys, and the viceroys tell the local towns what to do. Now, guys, all of this, there's a word for it, guys, and all of this is called bureaucracy. When you hear the word bureaucracy, it just means all of the groups of people that make up a government. All right? So the king and the council and all of the local officers and the viceroys, they all make up this thing called bureaucracy. Does the United States have a bureaucracy? Oh boy, does it. You've got the president and Congress and the Supreme Court and all the little officials that run around and all the secretaries and all the council people that go down into the local councils, the city councils, state councils. What a massive bureaucracy, right? Now, the more bureaucracy there is, the more messed up and confusing governments and laws and all of that stuff tends to get. So bureaucracy kind of has a bad reputation. But that's what a bureaucracy is. Everybody that makes up the government. All right, so one of the things under colonial government is it's ruled from the crown, who rules a council, right? Now, let's talk about trade regulation. Boy, guys, there's nothing that is more exciting to talk about than the regulation of trade. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what the word regulation means. All the word regulation means is like laws, okay? So when you see trade regulation, it means how does the government make trade work? With laws, all right? Regulation, trade. All right, excuse me. Regulation is like laws, all right? So all political structures in all of the colonies serve to support Spanish trade, okay? Technically, guys, all of the trade is supposed to go back and benefit the crown, all right? Now, how do you do that? Well, Spanish government only allowed ships with gold and goods to go in and out of very specific controlled ports, all right? Two of the ports in Spain that are the only ports that are allowed to trade in Spain are Cadiz and Seville. No other ports are technically allowed to trade. Now, trading outside of these ports was illegal. All right. So, what this means, guys, is that the crown has a monopoly over all trade. So, ships are only allowed to go into certain ports at certain times, and they had to be royal controlled ships. So, what if you were a guy that wanted to make your own money? And you didn't want to go through the Spanish crown. You wanted to get rich on yourself. Well, you'd have to go and do it illegally. You'd have to what's called smuggle. All right. So smuggling is rampant. Let me give you an example of smuggling. You guys know around school, right? Not everybody, but there's lots of people that have their whole duffel bags full of like burritos and stuff that they sell at school. Now, technically, under federal law and under state law and educational law code of California, it is illegal to do that. Why? Because the cafeteria and the school is supposed to have a monopoly over all the food that you consume. Why? So they can make money. So it's illegal for any of those people that walk around with the duffel bags, and we all know who they are. I'm not going to mention names here. I could, but I'm not going to. But anyway, technically, those guys are doing something very illegal. And you know what else they're doing? They're smuggling. They're going around the regulations and they're selling stuff on their own. So, smuggling was rampant in the Spanish Empire. And guess what, guys? Smuggling's pretty rampant here at school, isn't it? Pause if you need to. Now you guys are going to go around and see everybody that sells stuff. You're going to call them a smuggler, right? They're smugglers. Anyway, all right, now let's talk about colonial reform under the Spanish Bourbon monarchs. Now you might be like, wait, Bourbon monarchs, isn't that the French? Well, guys, we're going to talk about something in another lesson, not today, maybe a couple lessons from now. I think it's going to be 8.4 or 5. There's going to be this thing called the War of Austrian Succession. Succession, guys, is who gets the throne after you. Well, there's going to be a fight over the throne in Austria. And guess who's going to end up on the throne of Spain? It's going to be a Bourbon king, Philip V, which I think is a grandson or great-grandson. I don't know, guys, I can't think off the top of my head, but he is a relative of Louis XIV, Philip V. So, guys, a Bourbon French king is going to sit on the Spanish throne, and the Habsburgs in Spain are going to be replaced. But that's a little bit later on down the road. But here's what you need to know. When the French start ruling the Spanish crown and the Spanish colonies, all right, the Bourbon kings, they're going to make some changes. Now, you need to note these changes because the British are going to be watching these changes, and they're going to start ruling the 13 American colonies like the Bourbon kings in Spain. Now, what does that mean? Well, guys, Philip V knew that there was a lot of smuggling going on in Spain, and the Spanish were never really great at stopping that smuggling. So one of the things that Philip is going to try to do is patrol the colonial coast and really try to enforce all those trade laws. But you're going to see later on in another chapter when we talk about the War of Austrian Succession and the trade wars, you're going to see that's going to lead to wars with England because guess who is benefiting from the smuggling, guys? Other countries, right? Other countries don't want to go through the Spanish crown because it's more expensive. So what do? They go to those little smugglers that will give them a better price. So when the Spanish start to patrol the coasts, they start to run into English ships who are selling and trading with their smugglers, and that's going to lead to fights. But one of the things that Philip tries is to cut down on smuggling. And guess what the British are going to try to do in their own 13 American colonies? They're going to try to cut down on smuggling. And boy, does that really piss off the Americans. Now, later on, Charles III, another Bourbon monarch in Spain, is going to place colonial trade directly under control of royally appointed ministers. He's going to get rid of these councils that the Spanish used to have, and he's going to say, I'm going to bring it directly under control of me. Because if you think about it, guys, the more bureaucracy you have, the more likely you are to have corruption, because the more people that are working in government, the more likely there is to be someone that says, you know what, I want to make a little money on the side. Well, Charles III says, look, I'm going to get rid of all that, and I'm going to only have people I can trust directly under the king's command. Okay? Once again, guys, the British are going to try things like this. Now, another thing that Charles III is going to do is going to allow more ports to trade. Now, remember, I told you in Spain, only 2 ports were allowed to trade, Cadiz and Seville. Now, why were these 2 ports only allowed to trade? Well, the answer is you wanted to control, and the least amount of ports you have trading, the easier things are to control. But also, you are really limiting what you can trade, and you're limiting the amount of money that you could make in the future. So Charles III is going to allow more ports to open, but still be controlled by the crown. Another thing Charles III is going to do is going to create a more efficient tax collecting system. Now, I'm not going to go into the intendants or the intendants or whatever. I'm trying to see if I'm pronouncing that right. The French tax collectors. But basically, the French are going to bring in their own little tax system, okay, to the Spanish government. And it's going to be a little bit more efficient at collecting taxes. Now, if you are paying the taxes, you don't like this because you've been kind of not paying taxes as best you could. But now, guys, they're going to come in and really start clamping down and making sure the Spanish government gets their taxes. Guess what the British are going to do to the American colonies? They are going to start saying, you know what? You guys need to pay more taxes too. And boy, is that going to make the American colonies angry. You see how the British are really just going to start copying these things, guys? That's why it's important to learn this. Now, all of these actions are going to bring in more money to Spain, and they're going to decrease illegal activity. They're also going to anger the people that have been smuggling all this time. But like I also said, other nations are going to model their colonial governments after Spain. And these things are going to lead to things like the American Revolution. So like I said, this whole presentation, if you wanted to use it as context for a DBQ or context for an LEQ about the American Revolution, it would go, something like, prior to the American Revolution, the Bourbon kings under Spain implemented many reforms which changed the trading system in Spain. One of the reforms is they cut down on smuggling by patrolling the colonial coasts. Another form of reform that they did was Charles III allowing more ports to trade and creating more efficient tax collectors. The British are going to model their system after the Spanish, which is going to anger the American colonies, driving them towards revolution. Bam, guys, I just came up with that off the top of my head. Would that work for a context introductory paragraph in a DBQ or an LEQ? I think so, guys. But anyway, that's the end of the notes, guys. I'll see you in class.